And then, once having that foundation is laid, he goes on to build on that and says, now, here is where all your instruction begins after you have learnt the fear of God. First of all, in your home. As a child, with your father and mother. And notice how Proverbs links that together. Verse 7, the fear of the Lord. And verse 8, to honor your father and your mother. And I'll tell you something that I've seen through the short years of my life, that those who have never learned to sincerely, wholeheartedly honor their earthly father and their earthly mother, they never acquire wisdom. Even though they may increase fantastically in knowledge and even Bible knowledge, they never become wise. I've seen that again and again and again and again. Hear, my son, your father's instruction, and do not forsake your mother's teaching. Indeed, they are a graceful wreath to your head and ornaments about your neck. And there we see that the first commandment with promise was to honor your father and mother. And that's why if we want children to grow up into the wisdom of the book of Proverbs, we've got to first teach them to obey their parents. It's no use sending children to school if they haven't learned to obey daddy and mommy at home. It's an absolute waste of time. You haven't given them the education they need first of all. That's what we need to tell our children. Hear, my little son. Listen to what your father tells you. Listen to what your mother's telling you. And that's where we have to begin. And that's where all wisdom begins, with that little child at home. And if it begins like that, then as they grow up, this can promote them to honor. And notice in verse 9, this word grace comes. A wreath of grace to your head. It's very interesting to see. I told you that the book of Proverbs is like a New Covenant book in the Old Testament. The word grace comes a number of times in the book of Proverbs. It comes in the book of Zechariah where it says, I'll pour out upon them the spirit of grace. And in that New Testament sense, we can say it is found mostly only in Proverbs and in Zechariah. Consider, for example, Proverbs 3:34, which Peter quotes and James quotes. Proverbs 3:34 is, God resists the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. That was written by Solomon in the Old Testament, long before Peter and James wrote it in the New Testament. In fact, Peter and James quote it from Solomon in the Old Testament. He scoffs at the scoffers means he resists the proud. He gives grace to the afflicted, to the humble. And so we find this word grace coming in the book of Proverbs. And that's why this is a book that we need to study carefully in those of us who are come into the new covenant. And this word by which Solomon writes, verse 10, my son, verse 15, my son, chapter 2, verse 1, my son, chapter 3, verse 1, my son. He's speaking to someone who is willing to submit to him as a father. He's not speaking to people who have not understood the principle of submission. If we have not understood the principle of submission as a child to our earthly parents and in the church to those who are spiritually like fathers to us, we'll never get wisdom. It's written to those who can hear an exhortation which says, my son. Can you listen to that? Not when God says it, but when a man whom God has appointed over you says it. At home, an earthly father or mother. In the church, those who are above us in the Lord. Yeah, that's a very important principle. I've come to see more and more of late how so much revolves around this principle of submission to authority. And how God would do almost anything for a man or a woman who has understood that one principle of submission to authority. God will do anything for a child who has learned to submit to his parents, for a wife who has learned to submit to her husband, and for a person who has learned to submit to spiritual leadership in the church. Almost anything. That's a fundamental principle. And that's why the devil always tries to move us out from that place of submission so that God can do almost nothing for us. And we deprive ourselves of God's blessing because He gives grace to the humble, and the humble are those who have learned submission to authority. So, my son, if sinners entice you, if the first place where we have to learn wisdom is the home, verse 8 and 9, then the second place where we have to be careful is with our friends. Now, verse 8 and 9 is referring to the child at home. Verse 10 is referring to the young man who is now gone to school and is growing up, and there are other companions of his who are enticing him, inviting him to sin, just like it says, the lusts of the flesh entice us. Here are friends enticing this young man to sin. Sinners. Sinners are those who don't have the fear of God, who entice the young man through flattery, saying something nice to you so that he can entice you away from the way of truth. Saying to you, be a man, smoke a cigarette if you're a man, have a drink with me if you're a man, or do something else and prove that you're a man. And this young person who is wanting to be a man is tempted so much. Oh, I'm willing to show this person that I'm also a man. And thus he is enticed into sin. The Word of God says, my son, when sinners entice you, you've gone out of the home now, you're out with the friends out there, and they're trying to entice you, be careful. Do not consent. Don't be deceived by their flatteries. Don't be deceived by their challenges to be a man or a woman. No, you show that you're a man by saying, no, I'm not going to do what you say. I fear God. That's the proof that we have courage and that we are men of God. If they say, come with us, let us lie in wait for blood. Let us ambush the innocent without cause. Let us swallow them alive like Sheol, even whole as those who go down to the pit. This is speaking about some extreme condition of a gang of murderers inviting some young man saying, come, let's be like highway robbers and murderers and kill people let's lie in wait for them and ambush them and get their money, kill them to get their money. We shall find all kinds of precious wealth. We shall fill our houses with spoil. There we see enticing them to come and join them to commit murder. Now, I don't think any one of us sitting here is in danger of being enticed to join some gang of murderers. How shall we apply it to ourselves? We can apply it in this way and say, this is a backbiter inviting you to come and backbite against a brother. That is the New Covenant equivalent of murder. To shed a brother's blood or a sister's blood when he or she is not there. Come, let's talk about so-and-so. Something bad about so-and-so. Listen to the Word of God which says, my son, when sinners entice you to backbite, do not consent. Take a stand there. Don't participate with them. That's the warning for us. Why are these murderers and robbers after these innocent people? With one aim, to make themselves rich. We shall find all kinds of precious wealth. We shall fill our houses with spoil. That means with all this wealth. And it need not be murder. There are people who do all types of other things in order to get wealth and fill their houses. There are people who take bribes in order to fill their houses with television sets and video recorders and refrigerators and cars which they have got unrighteously. There are people who cheat the government of taxes in order to fill their houses with mixers and pressure cookers which they have been able to buy because they've cheated the government of taxes. There are so many ways. It doesn't have to be murder, but to fill my house with a lot of things and to do it with unrighteous money. There's a warning here. It's a warning against covetousness. It's a warning against the lust to fill our houses with things, when Jesus has said, a man's life does not consist in the abundance of things he has in his home. If God gives you the ability to get things that are useful, get them. But if He has chosen not to give you that ability, we've got to learn godliness with contentment and have no desire to do anything unrighteous or to be covetous in order to fill our houses, as it says in verse 13. And then it goes on in verse 14 about these robbers who are trying to entice this young man, saying, throw in your lot with us. We shall all have one purse. Do you know that this word, we shall all have one purse, is not Christianity? It's communism. And it's put here in the mouth of sinners. We shall all have one purse. Sometimes people think, there are some groups where people think that is spirituality, for everyone to live together and just have one purse. But you never find that anywhere in the Word of God. In fact, it's a misunderstanding of Acts chapter 2 and Acts chapter 4. If you read carefully in Acts chapter 2 and Acts chapter 4, it never says that they all had one purse. Nowhere. It says they had all things in common, in the sense that if a man had something, his brother was quite entitled to use it. That's right. All things in common means that if you have a cycle or a scooter, it must be perfectly available for another brother to use if he needs it. That's the meaning of having all things in common. Not that we all have one purse, because if we pool all our resources and have one purse, none of us will be able to learn faithfulness in money. It'll just encourage all the lazy people to join us. No, let's all have one purse is not Christianity. It's communism. And we are never to get into that deception. Some people have got into that deception and found it doesn't work, because God never intended that type of communism to be found among Christians. But to not possess anything as our own, but to give according to people's need, that is Christianity. I just mentioned that in passing. To share with the needy is Christianity, but to have a common purse is communism. And it also gives us a warning here about ungodly business partnerships. It's wrong for a believer to join hands with a man who doesn't have the fear of God in any business partnership. That's the meaning here also. Come, let us have one purse. Let's get into this business enterprise together, and we will be partners and share together in what we get. We shall share together the profit. That's the meaning. And when you join hands with those who don't have the fear of God, it's going to lead you into calamity. And there we need to hear the Word of God, which says, my son, when a sinner invites you into a joint business enterprise, do not consent. Now we move on to verse 15. My son, do not walk in the way with them, and keep your feet from their path. In other words, break such relationships that are leading you astray. Verse 16, because their feet run to evil, that means they don't have any principles in the way they do their business, and you'll be entangled with them in that. They hasten to shed blood. Then it goes on to say something very interesting. It uses a picture here about what it means to be greedy. You see, this is a young man who is growing up and wants to make money quickly, and therefore he's enticed by these people who say, come, we'll show you how to make money quickly. And they lead him in. Young people can take a warning from this, particularly when young people are newly married and they suddenly desire to have all the things in their home which many others who have been married for 15, 20 years have. And then they can be tempted in so many ways to do things that are unrighteous. Here it says in verse 17 and 18. Now I want to read it from the Good News Bible. It does no good to spread a net when the bird you want to catch is watching you. You understand that? I mean, to spread a net when that bird is watching, it's no use, because the bird's not going to come into that net. It's watching you spread the trap. But greedy men are more stupid than that bird, in the sense that they are setting a trap for themselves, a trap in which they will die because of their greed. That's the meaning of verses 17 and 18. That a man who is covetous, a man who is not conquered in his own flesh, the lust to possess more and more and more and more, to have what that brother has and to have what that person has, he doesn't realize that he's more stupid than a bird. A bird sees that trap and avoids it, but this greedy, covetous man, through his greed, is making a trap by which he's going to destroy and ruin his own life. And the Word of God speaks much about that in 1 Timothy chapter 6, about those who have the love of money piercing themselves through with many sorrows. It's very interesting to see how the book of Proverbs begins. The practical instruction it begins with is concerning mammon and the pursuit of mammon and the desire to acquire mammon quickly. That's what he speaks about, and how young people can be tempted in that way. So are the ways of everyone who gains by violence. Such is the fate of all who seek to make more in unrighteous ways. It takes away the life of its possessors. They lose their life.